Section 24 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Milestone 15, Part 1. 1891 to 1892. On April 26, 1891, the new tabernacle was opened. There were 3 dedication services, and thousands of people came. I was 59 years of age. Up to this time, everything had been extraordinary in its conflict, its warnings. I found myself, after over 30 years of service to the gospel, pastor of the biggest Protestant church in the world. It seems to me there were more men of indomitable success during my career in America than at any other time. There were so many self-made men, so many who compelled the world to listen, and feel, and do as they believed, men of remarkable energy, of prophetic genius. Everywhere in England I had been asked about Cyrus W. Field. He was the hero of the 19th century. In his days of sickness and trouble the world remembered him. Of all the population of the earth, he was the one man who believed that a wire could be strung across the Atlantic. It took him 12 years of incessant toil, and 50 voyages across the Atlantic. I remember well in 1857, when the cable broke, how everyone joined in the great chorus of "I Told You So." There was a great jubilee in that choral society of wise know-nothings. 30 times the grapnel searched the bottom of the sea and finally caught the broken cable, and the pluck and ingenuity of Cyrus W. Field was celebrated. Ocean cablegrams had ceased to be a curiosity, but some of us remember the day when they were. I kept a memorandum of the 2 first messages across the Atlantic that passed between Queen Victoria and President Buchanan in the summer of 1858. From England, in the Queen's name, came this: To the President of the United States, Washington. The Queen desires to congratulate the President upon the successful completion of this great international work, in which the Queen has taken the deepest interest. The Queen is convinced that the President will join with her in fervently hoping that the electric cable which now connects Great Britain with the United States will prove an additional link between the nations, whose friendship is founded upon their common interest and reciprocal esteem. The Queen has much pleasure in thus communicating with the President and renewing to him her wishes for the prosperity of the United States. The President's answering cable was as follows: To Her Majesty Victoria, Queen of Great Britain. The President cordially reciprocates the congratulations of Her Majesty the Queen on the success of the great international enterprise accomplished by the science, skill, and indomitable energy of the 2 countries. It is a triumph more glorious than was ever won by any conquest on the field of battle. May the Atlantic Telegraph, under the blessing of Heaven, prove to be a bond of perpetual peace and friendship between the kindred nations, and an instrument designed by divine providence to diffuse religion, civilization, liberty, and law throughout the world. In this view, will not all nations of Christendom spontaneously unite in the declaration that it shall be forever neutral, and that its communications shall be held sacred in passing to their destination, even in the midst of hostilities. James Buchanan. It is interesting to compare the elemental quality, the inner character of these national flashes of feeling, that came so comparatively soon after the days of the Revolution in America. It was a sort of prose poetry of the new century. This recollection came back to me on my return from Europe, upon the opening of the new tabernacle, a symbol of the eternal human progress of the world. Materially and spiritually we were striving ahead, men of affairs, men of religion, philosophers, scientists, and poets. I was present in 1891 at the celebration of Whittier's 84th birthday. He was on the bright side of 80 then. The schools celebrated the day, so should the churches have done, for he was a Christian poet. John Greenleaf Whittier was a Quaker. That means that he was a genial, kind, good man, a simple man. I spent an afternoon with him once in a barn. We were summering in the mountains near by. We found ourselves in the barn, where we stretched out on the hay. The world had not spoiled the simplicity of his nature. It was an afternoon of pastoral peace, with one who had written himself into the heart of a nation. How much I learned from that man's childlikeness and simplicity! If he had lived to be 100, he would still have remained young. The long flight of years had not tired his spirit, for wherever the English language is spoken he will always live. He was born in Christmas week, a spirit in human shape, come to earth to keep it forever young. He was the bell ringer of all youthful ages. And yet he remembered also those who for any reason could not join in the merriment of the holidays. To those I recommend Whittier's poem, in which he celebrates the rescue of two Quakers who had been fined £10 for attending church instead of going to a Quaker meeting house, and not being able to pay the fine, were first imprisoned and then sold as slaves. But no shipmaster consenting to carry them into slavery, they were liberated. The closing stanza of this poem is worth remembering. Now let the humble ones arise, the poor in heart be glad, and let the mourning ones again with robes of praise be clad. For he who cooled the furnace, and smoothed the stormy wave, and turned the Chaldean lions, is mighty still to save. The new tabernacle more than met our expectations. From the day we opened it, it was a great blessing. It seated 6,000 persons, and when crowded held 7,000. There was still some debt on the building, for the entire enterprise had cost us about $400,000. There were regrets expressed that we did not follow the elaborate custom of some fashionable churches in these days, and introduce into our services operatic music. I preferred the simple form of sacred music, a cornet and organ. Everybody should get his call from God, and do his work in his own way. I never had any sympathy with dogmatics. There is no church on earth in which there is more freedom of utterance than in the Presbyterian Church. We were in the midst of a religious conflict on many sacred questions in 1892. There came upon us a plague called higher criticism. My idea of it was that higher criticism meant lower religion. The Bible seemed to me entirely satisfactory. The chief hindrance to the gospel was this everlasting picking at the Bible by people who pretended to be its friends, but who themselves had never been converted. The higher criticism was only a flurry. The world started as a garden, and it will close as a garden. That there may be no false impression of the sublime destiny of the world as I see it, let me add that it is not a garden of idleness and pleasure, but a vineyard in which all must labor from early morning till the glory of sundown wraps us in its revival robes of golden splendor. What a changing, hurrying world of desperate means it is! What a mirage of towering ambition is the whole of life! I have so often wondered why men, great men of heart and brain, should ever die out, though they pass on to live forever under brighter skies. In January 1892, Congressman William E. Robinson was buried from our church, and in February of the same month Spurgeon died in England. Though men may live at swords' points with each other, they die in peace. This last forgetfulness is some of the beautiful moss that grows on the ruins of poor human nature. Congressman Robinson was among the gifted men of his time. His friends were giants, his work was constructive, his pen an instrument of literary force. He landed in America with less than a sovereign in his pocket, and achieved prominence in national and state affairs. I knew him well, and respected him. There is an affinity of souls on earth, and doubtless in heaven. We seek those who are our kindred souls when we reach there. In this respect, I always feel a sense of gratitude, of cheerfulness for those who have passed on. My old friend, Charles H. Spurgeon, in February 1892, made his last journey, and I am sure that the first whom he picked out in heaven were the souls of Jonathan Edwards and John Calvin, two men of tremendous evangelism. I first met Spurgeon in London in 1872. "I read your sermons," I said to him first. "Everybody reads yours," he replied. Spurgeon made a long battle against disease, the last few months in agony. His name is on the honor roll of the world's history, but for many years he was caricatured and assailed. He kept a scrapbook of the printed blasphemy against him. The first picture I ever saw of him represented him as sliding down the railing of his pulpit in the presence of his congregation, to show how easy it was to go to hell, and then climbing up on the opposite railing to show how difficult it was to get to heaven. Most people at the time actually believed that he had done this. In this same month Dr. Mackenzie, the famous physician, died, and my old friend, the Reverend Dr. Hannah of Belfast, the leading Protestant minister of Ireland. Out of the darkness into the light, out of the struggle into victory, out of earth into heaven. There was always mercy on earth, however, for those who remained. Mercy, the biggest word in the human language. I remember how it impressed me when, at the invitation of Dr. Leslie Keeley, the inventor of the gold cure for drunkenness, I visited his institution at Dwight, Illinois. It was a new thing then, and a most merciful miracle of the age. It settled no question perhaps, but intensified the blessings of reformed thought. There were questions that could not be solved, however, questions of industrial moment that we almost despaired of. The tariff was one of them. I felt convinced that the tariff question would never be settled. The grandchildren of every generation will always be discussing it, and thresh out the same old straw which the Democrats and Republicans were discussing before them. When I was a boy of only 8 years old, the tariff was discussed just as warmly as it will ever be. Like my friend Henry Watterson of Kentucky, I was a free trader. Politics were so mixed up it was difficult to see ahead. Cleveland was after Hill, and Hill was after Cleveland. That alone was clear to everybody. For my own satisfaction, in the spring of 1892, I went to see what Washington was really doing, thinking, living. It had improved morally and politically. Its streets were still the trail of the mighty. A great change had taken place there. A higher type of men had taken possession of our national halls. Dueling, once common, was entirely abolished, and a senator who would challenge a fellow member to fight would make himself a laughing-stock. No more clubbing of senators on account of opposite opinions. Mr. Covode of Pennsylvania no longer brandished a weapon over the head of Mr. Barksdale of Mississippi. Grow and Keitt no more took each other by the throat. Griswold no more pounded Lyon, Lyon snatching the tongs and striking back until the two members in a scuffle rolled on the floor of the great American Congress. One of the senators of 25 years ago died in Flatbush Hospital, idiotic from his dissipations. One member of Congress I saw years ago seated drunk on the curbstone in Philadelphia, his wife trying to coax him home. A senator from New York many years ago on a cold day was picked out of the Potomac into which he had dropped through his intoxication, the only time that he ever came so near losing his life by too much cold water. Talk not about the good old days, for the new days in Washington were far better. There was John Sherman of the Senate, a moral, high-minded, patriotic, and talented man. I said to him as I looked up into his face, "How tall are you?" And his answer was, 6 feet 1 inch and a half. And I thought to myself, "You are a tall man every way, with mental stature overtowering like physical." There was Senator Daniel of Virginia, magnetic to the last degree, and when he spoke all were thrilled while they listened. 15 years ago, at Lynchburg, Virginia, I said to him, "The next time I see you, I will see you in the United States Senate." "No, no," he replied, "I am not on the winning side. I am too positive in my opinions." I greeted him amid the marble walls of the Senate with the words, "Didn't I tell you so?" "Yes," he said, "I remember your prophecy." There also were Senators Colquitt and Gordon of Georgia. At home, whether in secular or religious assemblages, pronounced Christian gentlemen, and both of them tremendous in utterance. There was Senator Carey of Wyoming, who was a boy in my church debating society at Philadelphia, his speech at 18 years demonstrating that nothing in the way of grand achievement would be impossible. There was Senator Manderson of Nebraska, his father and mother among my chief supporters in Philadelphia. The senator walking about as though he cared nothing about the bullets which he had carried ever since the war, of which he was one of the heroes. Brooklyn was proud of her congressman. I heard our representative, Mr. Coombs, speak, and whether his hearers agreed or disagreed with his sentiments on the tariff question, all realized that he knew what he was talking about, and his easy delivery and point-blank manner of statement were impressive. So, also at the White House, whether people liked the administration or disliked it, all reasonable persons agreed that good morals presided over the nation, and that well-worn jest about the big hat of the grandfather, President William Henry Harrison, being too ample for the grandson, President Benjamin Harrison, was a witticism that would soon be folded up and put out of sight. Anybody who had carefully read the 120 addresses delivered by President Benjamin Harrison on his tour across the continent knew that he had 3 times the brain ever shown by his grandfather. Great men, I noticed at Washington, were great only a little while. The men I saw there in high places 15 years ago had nearly all gone. One venerable man, seated in the Senate near the Vice President's chair, had been there since he was introduced as a page at 10 years of age by Daniel Webster. But a few years changed the most of the occupants of high positions. How rapidly the wheel turns! Call the roll of Jefferson's cabinet? Dead. Call the roll of Madison's cabinet? Dead. Call the roll of Monroe's cabinet? Dead. Call the roll of Pierce's cabinet? Dead. Call the roll of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet? Dead. The Congressional Burying Ground in the city of Washington had then 170 cenotaphs raised in honor of members. While I was in Chicago in the spring of 1892, there came about an almost national discussion as to whether the World's Fair should be kept open on Sunday. Nearly all the ministers foresaw empty churches if the fair were kept open. In spite of the personal malice against me of one of the great editors of New York, the people did not seem to lose their confidence in the Christian spirit. Both Dr. Parkhurst and myself were targets of this brilliant man's sarcasm and satire at this time, but neither of us were demoralized or injured in the course of our separate ways of duty. In the summer of 1892, the working plans of what the newspapers generously called my vacation took me to Europe on a tour of Great Britain and Ireland, including a visit to Russia, to await the arrival of a shipload of food sent by the religious weekly of which I was editor. Some criticism was made of the way I worked instead of rested in vacation time. Someone asked me if I believed in dreams. I said no, I believed in sleep, but not in dreams. The Lord in olden times revealed himself in dreams, but I do not think he does so often now. When I was at school we parsed from Young's Night Thoughts, but I had no very pleasant memories of that book. I had noticed that dreamers are often the prey of consumption. It seems to have a fondness for exquisite natures, dreamy, spiritual, a foe of the finest part of the human family. There was Henry Kirke White, the author of that famous hymn, When Marshalled on the Nightly Plains, who, dying of consumption, wrote it with 2 feet in the grave, and recited it with power when he could not move from his chair. End of Section 24. Recording by Colleen McMahon.